What's the creepiest/paranormal activity you ever encountered? Bit of background. When my wife was young, her parents and siblings lived with one set of her grandparents. Her grandfather was murdered in the home. It happened in his bedroom upstairs. The room was used primarily as storage for the next 20+ years. Her parents tried to sell the house multiple times, but living in a small town, everyone knew and the house would not sell, so they stayed. Years later, and while my wife and I were engaged, there was a murder trial which I attended in support of her family. I saw the crime scene photos. Important later, another few years later, we had 2 kids, the oldest was time. My wife's family does not talk about the murder, and our kids do not know about the murder to this day. My Phil decided he wanted the room where the murder happened to be a hangout for the grandkids when the family was in town. He put sleeping bags and a TV in the room ahead of a holiday, days-long get-together. We didn't like it but stayed silent since the murder was a sore subject. My Phil also wanted all the grandkids to all sleep in there together. We were the first to arrive and my son went into the room alone. He usually couldn't sit still long at that age, so after a couple of hours I decided to check in on him. Here's our conversation. During the whole conversation, he was still and rigid and would not look away from the TV. "Hey buddy, is everything okay up here?" "Yeah. Okay, have fun." "Daddy, do I have to sleep in here?" "I don't want to." "Why not?" "I am not alone." Every hair on my body stood up. "Well yeah, I'm here with you buddy." "No, there is someone in here with us." "Are they nice, mean, a grown-up? A kid?" "A grown-up." "What are they doing right now?" "They are watching you." "You have never said anything like this at your grandparents' house before and you have been here a lot." "They don't leave this room and I have never been in here before." "Where are they now?" Without looking away from the TV, he points to the far corner where his great-grandfather was murdered and said, "They are standing over there, they don't move much." "Okay buddy, you don't have to stay in here," and he left the room with me. My dad worked in security. I got into it after he passed. One night I was called on my night off. They need someone to go fill in on another site. I never worked the site before but hey, overtime, I accepted. It was one of my dad's old sites. So it is about 02:00, I am doing a round. I enter one of the buildings and I think I see someone moving up ahead. It is 02:00 and the building is locked. There should not be anyone in there. I quietly close the door behind me and creep up for a closer look. At the end of the hall is a security guard, which is odd as I am the only guard on duty at the time, so I am eyeing the sky, and I notice the uniform. It is for a company that doesn't exist anymore. In fact it is for the company my dad worked for when he was at this site, so it hits me that it is my dad. I'm standing there watching him. He is apparently doing a round of the building I am patrolling. So I watch him. He looks directly at me as if he could see me. He looks at me for about 30 seconds or so, he then turns the corner. I run to catch up with him but he was gone. Almost 2 years later I still swear I actually saw him that night. I don't know if it was a ghost, if I was hallucinating because it was one of his old posts and I was emotional, or if maybe somehow time loops exist and I actually saw him working the site in the past. I honestly don't know but every time I have a night off and they can't find anyone to fill in, I jump in it, no longer for the overtime but with the hope that whatever happened that first time happens again. I have filled in there over 20 times since that encounter and I haven't seen anything since. In high school, I was babysitting for a single mom and her 2 kids. It was the middle of winter and when I arrived it was already pitch black out, around like 6 p.m. She lived in a duplex, while I was standing in the living room with her and her girls talking about how the rest of the night would go. A little boy in full snow gear came in through her front door, stomped through the living room past us and headed down the stairs to the basement. The mom never even looked at him or stopped talking. The girls didn't make any acknowledgement that they saw him. I was super weirded out but I was also an extremely introverted teenager so I didn't ask the mom what was up. Once the mom left, I asked the girls who the little boy was that came in and they both had no idea what I was talking about. So I got brave and grabbed a broom and headed downstairs. It was a small unfinished basement, one single room with no closets or anything. No one was down there and the little boy definitely had not come back upstairs in that time. So weird and the only time I have truly believed I experienced something paranormal. I normally scoff at ghost stories and stuff. I worked in an elderly care home doing night shift. A lady named Elizabeth who had Alzheimer's came down, which was scary in itself. In her long nightie, she told me all about living in Sheffield, her parents and her love of church music. I had to go check everyone and do some toileting. Not a huge home, about 12 residents. When I got to her room, she shared with another lady I found Elizabeth in bed, passed away. To this day I don't know if I had sat chatting to her ghost or she had gone back to bed and died. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the phone frozen. Long-time ER nurse, I've seen this. One night we were holding a patient in the ER, waiting for a bed upstairs. She was late 80s, nearing death. She was a DNR, and there wasn't a lot we could do but keep her comfortable. Don't recall the exact diagnosis, but she was deeply unresponsive, breathing on her own, but was already having significant heart rhythm problems. Looked like she had maybe an hour or two left. No family, so we would just check in on her frequently. I looked down the hall and sister is standing at the door to her room, looking down the hall at the nurse's station. Said she was hungry. Under the circumstances, I'm not pulling the doctor said you can't eat anything right now crap. We went to the cafeteria and loaded her up with food. We set up a table at the door to her room and took turns sitting with her while she ate. She's just chatting like nothing's wrong. After a bit she said she was tired and wanted to lie back down. We helped her back into bed, where she went back to sleep. She was gone within the hour. Even knowing that terminal patients will sometimes rally right at the end, it was still jarring. I can easily see why people would see this as something supernatural / paranormal / whatever. When I was a teenager, my bedroom was in the basement. You could hear clearly anytime someone came down the stairs, and my bed was creaky. Like lay down, sit or move, and the springs would let anyone nearby know creaky. I was just starting to fall asleep one night and heard footsteps. I thought, no big deal. It's probably my mom coming to do laundry. Fell back asleep. I felt pressure on the bed behind me. I slept with my back to the stairs, and it creaked. Everything in me was screaming, don't move. Don't move, just lay here and don't move. I eventually fell asleep out of exhaustion. This happened multiple times, and one night I had enough of being terrified, and when I heard the creak I hadn't moved to do it, and felt the pressure next to me, I rolled over and sat up. Nothing. There was nobody physically there. I've experienced things before that and since, but that was the one that freaked me out the most. Multiple times I was laying in bed facing the wall, like usual, when I felt like someone was sitting down on the edge of my bed. I was terrified. Until one day it felt like someone was laying down next to me. I quickly turned around, but nothing was there. I didn't sleep in my bed from that day on for several weeks and moved to the couch in the living room. Then one night I was so annoyed by our cat that I thought FCK it and went to sleep in my room. I laid down facing the door. All fine. Until I woke up to what heard like my parents were loudly arguing in the kitchen downstairs. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow standing in the open door with one hand holding the doorknob. Just when I woke up enough to realize this was certainly not a person, the dark figure slammed the door as hard as someone could slam a door. I flinched hard, and after that, like all of a sudden, my door wasn't even closed anymore, and the light from the kitchen downstairs that usually shined through my open door was also gone. I went to my mom asking her if she heard anything or if she had guests or whatever, but she didn't hear anything and was still silently sitting in the living room reading a book. From that day on, I never had this someone sitting down on my bed feeling ever again. Ex-husband's family owns a massive farmhouse that was built in the late 1800s and has been passed down through generations. They inherited from a pair of bachelor brothers and their sister, Aunt Kate. So it goes, she died in the attic, so that's why you hear pacing up there at night. She loves to take things like ex-Mills jewelry and move it around the house. The music room used to be used as the funeral parlor for that area way back in the day. They had the original furnace in the basement that looked big enough to burn bodies. One time I came home and noticed my cat was halfway off the ottoman, kneading with his paws like something not there was petting him and holding the front half of him. I went over and ran my hand under him, but not touching him, and he fell down. X was woken up one night with a lady in white standing over him staring down at him. X is an electrician / farmer who wouldn't make shit up, and Kate's room that she once lived in is freezing cold all year round. There's no AC and it gets hot and humid in that house. One time I slept in there and had 7 quilts on in the middle of summer. I went to bed with the door closed. They all squeak loudly when opened, and the wood floors squeak too. In the middle of the night I sort of woke up feeling hands going up and down me, tucking the blankets in my sides like you do with little kids. I opened my eyes even though I was terrified and nothing was there. The door was open too, which would have woken me up from loud squeak. Ex remarried and had a daughter who always sees an old man in overalls at the top of the stairs who doesn't want her to go up. She's 10 now and has seen him constantly since she was little. When I was pregnant and alone in bed, I'd hear scratching/tapping coming from inside my walls nearly every night. I've had squirrels and mice in my walls before and know how they sound. This was different. It would start right by my head and slowly make its way up the wall to the ceiling, then turn and start down the other wall on the opposite side of my bed. Every night for like a month this would happen, but I was so exhausted, I would just force myself to sleep. Then it all came to a head one night. The tapping/scratches would start as normal up the wall, but then it stopped when it got to the ceiling. Next thing I know, something has landed on the tops of my blanketed legs. It felt like a cat or something. I screamed, turned on the light and tore out of bed. Nothing was there. I checked the entire room, under the bed, in the closet. Nothing. I slept down on the couch that night. The next night the scratches/tapping starts up again on my wall, but I had had enough at this point. I yelled loudly into my dark room, "Knock it off tonight. I want to sleep." And it stopped. Just like that. Never heard another tapping or scratching sound again. The fact that it was intelligent enough to respect my wishes though is what scares me the most. A couple of friends, and one hot roommate, rented a house in the next city over. One floor. Had a partially finished basement. The owner started the job but never completed it, only the outer walls and one interior room were put in. The main area was open with a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. Scattering of old furniture around. My friends used to use the basement to host parties. Apparently, there was a standing request not to sleep down there, a request that I did not hear. We were maybe 20 or 21 at the time. Well, after one party, people started going to sleep wherever they could find space, and I picked the only open spot I could find, this old couch in that basement. I wake up after just a few hours, must have been 4 or 5 a.m., and I hear a guy and girl whispering and giggling in that partially built next room. It sounded like someone who was at the party, so I got up to ask them to be quiet, and as soon as I got near the doorway, it stopped. Weird. But I thought maybe I was hearing people still partying upstairs, and it just sounded like whispering through the floor, no biggie. It didn't start back up, so I decided to ignore it and try to go back to sleep. I laid back down. That bright light was shining in my face, and I wasn't sure how to turn it off, so I closed my eyes and just tried to fall asleep anyways. While I'm laying on the couch with my eyes closed, I saw a shadow move across my eyelids, as if something moved between me and that light. So at this point I sit bolt upright, and said nope, 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 nope over and over again as I started walking towards the stairs. The cement floor was a bit uneven, so I'd hear a scuffing noise with some of my footsteps, but I'd hear it even when my shoe didn't scrape the floor. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened, and those shuffling footsteps kept going, so I sprinted up the stairs and paused one more time at the top and looked back and saw nothing. I don't know, I expected to see someone. I waited maybe 10 seconds, listening out, and finally I hear what sounds like a single footfall on wood and creak of that bottom stair. I shut the door behind me and backed away watching it, but nothing ever came through. I'm frantically trying to find one of my friends who rented the place without waking anyone up, and I find the roommate on an air mattress, in the living room, which is weird but whatever. I start shaking her, and I go see, wake up. Your basement is haunted. She just looks at me like I'm an idiot and says, duh. We told everyone not to sleep down there. And I just went, oh, so can I crash on the corner of the air mattress? And she said I could. So the next day, I get all of the ghost stories from them about this house. Apparently, the main floor was haunted too, and the basement was just the worst spot for it. I work overnight as an RN on a pediatric ICU floor. Most of our patients are sedated, paralyzed, tracheostomy and ventilator dependent, etc. One side of the floor is where our acute trauma kids go, severe accidents, drownings, etc., and the other side is where our chronic kids go. These are usually the kids that are termed our frequent flyers. When they're not in the hospital, they live at a facility that provides 24-hour medical care. Once they get discharged, it's only a matter of time before they're back, usually 2 to 3 weeks, usually due to respiratory failure. Most of them do not have parents that visit or call. They just lay there staring at the ceiling and get their medications and tube feedings. It's very depressing on that side. One of my patients was a chronic kid. She was 5 years old. Her medical history was incredibly complex. She was trodden ventilator dependent, she was delayed but she was with it, so to speak. Every time she was readmitted to our floor and I had her as a patient, she would smile the biggest smile when I'd walk in at the start of my shift. I made it a point to spend time in her room with her whenever I could, since she didn't have parents who came. I would do silly dances or sing her songs and make her smile. Since she had a trot and was hooked to the vent, she wasn't able to make noise. So when she would cry, it was silent and you would just see the tears streaming down her face. She absolutely loved the movie Frozen. It always made her stop crying. If I would walk in and the movie was finished, she would tug on the sleeve of my scrub to play it again and I would. That was our thing. I didn't mind being on the chronic side as much when she was there. I care for all of my patients, but she held a special spot and I believe she knew it. She was discharged back to the medical facility she lived at. It had been a while since she came back this time, maybe 2 to 3 months. But when she did, she looked bad. Worse than ever. She required way more oxygen than her usual baseline this time. She had lost a lot of weight, she was already very small for her age, her eyes were sunken. It hurt me to see her that way. I did my dances and my songs and she didn't smile. I would talk to her and she wouldn't react. She wasn't really tracking and following with her eyes. She wasn't herself anymore, she was clearly deteriorating. This was expected due to the multiple congenital issues she was suffering from. But still, it was hard to watch. She was there a few weeks and her prognosis was pretty poor. My last shift with her, she was hardly able to raise her arm. But she did, just to tug on my sleeve so I could put Frozen on. So I did. It was otherwise a regular night. I went home and slept and woke up just in time to come back for my next shift. I was expecting to get my same patient assignment and I saw I had the same room number, but the name was different. There was someone else in her room. I asked what happened and their faces all fell as they told me she had coded in the morning and they weren't able to get her back. She passed away. I wasn't there. I was totally devastated. I held it together and I didn't cry, but this shift had a heaviness to it. I was really sad and it just felt like I was drifting from room to room the whole night. Fast forward to 3 a.m. I needed to go into that room to start the new patient's tube feed. There was nothing on the TV but the patient was awake. I put on the movie Coco so he would at least have some background noise. As I was starting the pump, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and I had goosebumps down my arms. Just as I was about to turn to leave, I felt it. 2 tugs on my sleeve. I froze in place. At first I felt really afraid, but then I got the most overwhelming rush of emotion all at once. I ran to the bathroom and I cried so hard. It took me a while to gather myself. I splashed water on my face and went back to my desk to chart, trying to shake off what had happened and just tell myself it was impossible. My grief was causing me to imagine things. At 4 a.m., exactly 1 hour later, the feed was done. I went to the room and I paused at the doorway. Frozen was playing. I had only put Coco on 1 hour ago. It couldn't have been finished. I stood there in disbelief. I've never really had anything paranormal happen to me before. But in that moment I had the warmest feeling. I just knew she was trying to tell me she was okay or something. I can't explain it, but it made me smile. I've been in that room plenty of times since and nothing weird has ever happened again. It only happened that one night that she passed. It's almost like she was saying goodbye. And I'm glad. I would be sad if even in the afterlife she was confined to a hospital room. I like to think that wherever she is, she's free to walk and laugh and watch Frozen on repeat. I stayed in my wife's room at her mom's home in Yorktown, VA when our first child was born. I would always observe my infant talk to something in the room. He would cry non-stop and then would start cooing at something or to himself. One day, while I was sleeping, I felt something choking me. I opened my eyes thinking it was a nightmare, and still couldn't breathe. This went on for 5 to 10 seconds longer. I've always felt creeped out in that room. Weeks later, I mentioned this story to my wife's best friend, and the same thing happened to her. Never believed in ghosts, but there is something going on at that house. I know there used to be slave plantations around that location back in the day. I was at my grandparents', getting changed in the bathroom to go swimming in their pool. The bathroom had a small octagon-shaped window. The window was high up, and overlooked the porch. I was sitting on the toilet below it, when I looked up and saw a man, who looked like he was screaming through the window. His skin looked like it was burned and smoldering, his hair was patchy and dark and his expression never changed. It was like he was frozen in time. For some reason I didn't mention it to anyone and just quickly bolted out of the bathroom and went to the one upstairs without a window and did so until my grandparents moved out of that house. The house wasn't old or creepy. The ghost of a former owner is here in my house. I've seen her 3 times, always in the hallway. We expanded the bathroom and covered the bathroom door and made another door to the bathroom from the laundry room. Every time I've seen her, she comes out of the wall where the old bathroom door used to be. I was walking home one night from my grandmother's house. We lived in a village in rural Ireland. Granny's house was on the outskirts of the village, so I had to walk up a narrow country lane to get to Granny's house and back down the lane to get toward the village. My granddad was dying and the priest had him the last rites. He pulled through the night and my granny told me to go home and get a bit of a rest. I reluctantly agreed and walked home. Down the country lane, I've been walking on since I was a boy. Only this time it seemed weird in some way. Almost eerie, and I never get spooked. I pushed the feeling to the side as my mind was in shock about Granddad. I was walking toward the bottom of the lane when I noticed a blur of white down the bottom of the lane beside one of the farmer's gates to the field beside my grandparents' house. I thought it was a lamb escaped. It happens a lot. I walked toward it to investigate. When I walked toward the blur of white, it felt like electricity entered every inch of my body. The hairs were standing up on my arms and what was left on the top of my head. I stood frozen in perpetual fear as the figure was an old hunched woman in a white robe and she just screamed the most merciful scream. The guttural scream was so frightening, I actually stopped breathing with sheer fear. I looked up into her face and saw nothing, just a blur. The cry was ungodly, like a mother finding out their child is dead. The most scariest scream I've ever witnessed. Adrenaline must have kicked in because I legged it straight back up the lane toward Granny's house and legged it in the front door. I could hear my granny rushing out Granddad's room crying. She said Granda's gone. Imagine he just passed away within the 5 minutes of me leaving and encountering the woman on the lane. I remember telling my elderly aunt and a few family members about the woman, and they said that she was a friend of the family by now. She only appears when someone is going to die. I thought they were taking the piss until my father, a born skeptic and very religious man, confirmed the woman's existence. In some families in Ireland, she would be called the Banshee. I'll never forget her. Not even when I'm on my own deathbed will I ever forget the howl. When I was a kid, we lived pretty far out of town, heading up into the mountains, right next to old railroad tracks. The area was big for logging, and at one time, gold mining. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. The moon was bright, and made it easy to see. For some reason, I peeked out the blinds, and about 20 yards away, standing on the road, was a man. He was wearing an old miner's hat, and was just standing completely still, staring at our house. I have no idea if he could see me, but I was frozen. After about 10 minutes I eased away from the window, and laid in bed, trying not to think about it. About an hour later, still not able to sleep, I checked the window again, and he was still there. It freaked me out, so I refused to look out the window again that night. I kind of forgot about this incident, until several years later, the exact same thing happened again. Another bright moon. I once again woke up in the middle of the night, and felt compelled to look out the window. Same man, same hat, standing in the same spot, just staring. I never talked to anyone about it, and I'm not sure if it was something paranormal, or just a man with a creepy habit. When I was little I had a toy wand and pointed it at the sky and yelled "let it snow," and it started snowing. That's all I've got. When I was little the family was out watching a meteor shower and my uncle tells us you can call meteors with a flashlight. He offers a demonstration. He shines the flashlight up into the sky and sure enough that exact second one hit. My eyes got huge and I begged him do it again. He confessed that he was just teasing and that was just a coincidence and did it again several times to show me, but I didn't believe him. I knew he was doing it wrong on purpose, so I didn't learn his adult secret. I spent many nights of my childhood with a flashlight trying to learn his meteor calling skill. I'm from Vancouver, BC. Wife and I stayed at the Empress, known for being haunted etc. Google it, hotel in Victoria for my sister's wedding weekend. Nothing weird happened while we were there, but when we got home back to Vancouver on the Sunday night, My wife was unpacking both our suitcases to do laundry etc. I hear from the laundry room say WTF. She comes out holding some clothes, says where the hell did these come from? It was a set of women's flannel pajamas. Very large. Like it could have fit me, 6'3" 240. But they looked like something a 90-years-old granny would wear. We googled the brand on the label, was some mom and pop shop in a southern US state, can't recall which. They only sell at local farmers markets etc. Weird. When I was around 7, I had been feeling sick one day and fell asleep on the sofa in my dad's office, which has 2 doors and is between the kitchen and a hallway. I must have fallen asleep in the early evening and slept like a rock until I woke up in the middle of the night with our 2 cats locked in the office with me, and they were meowing frantically. I was sick, a little kid, and I didn't know what to do, so I just sat there and cried. After a couple minutes my older brother must have heard me, which was weird because he used to listen to / wear his Walkman headphones at night, because he opened the door from the kitchen side and reached out for me as if to say, "Alright, come here." He had his Walkman and headphones in the other hand. I took his hand and he walked me downstairs to his bed, and he let me sleep with him that night. Years later when I was a teenager I was retelling that story at some family event and my brother cut me off to say that he didn't come upstairs. I walked down to his room. I had woken up disoriented and scared. There was no way I left that room by myself. I was also skittish of my dad's basement at that age, hence needing the escort. I vividly remember just sitting there crying when he opened the door, while he has equally specific memories of me showing up next to his bed. So to this day, who or what took my hand and walked me downstairs is anyone's guess. 1. At an old Norman castle in southeast England, the one with a single round tower, was playing hide and seek with my sister. Found shelter in a small archway under the castle walls above what used to be the moat. Was hiding and peeking around the wall when I heard a voice in my ear saying go. I ran for my life and never looked back. I swear that castle is haunted. 2. Living in a Victorian 2 up 2 down, again SE England, with an outside toilet with my first serious long-term partner as an adult. We moved in and placed the rabbit hutch in the yard outside between the kitchen and old toilet. The rabbit died frothing at the mouth within an hour. Several weeks later, sat watching TV in the front room and a picture we had of dolphins just lifted off its nail, floated about 12 inches off the wall then fell to the ground and shattered. We moved out when the 6-month tenancy was up. I have a haunted house in SC. It's an old plantation house that is abandoned now but we still own it. One time we heard something jump off of a bed upstairs and footsteps right after. Like a dog. But the only dog in the house was right next to my feet. This sound repeated every 10-ish minutes for at least an hour. Only after I checked the room did the sound stop. Another time I was home alone and heard a loud crash. Like something got smashed. I ran to the dining room, where I heard the noise, and the giant painting above the fireplace was on the ground very broken. However, the giant nail holding the painting in place was still there, at an upward angle. The string to the painting was still intact. The only way that painting would have fallen is if something picked it up and smashed it. I then thought there was someone in the house, so I called the cops. This giant ex-football SC trooper showed up, tough as nails kind of guy. He searched the house with me, had his gun drawn, and was visibly shaking. He dropped his gun twice, shaking. He left shortly after not finding anyone, and floored it out of the driveway. Another time I was lying in bed sick, and there is a closet with an old door handle. It's also really hard to open. It had a giant latch and the wood door grinds against the floor. So here I am, in bed, and the handle starts turning. The door opens, just a crack, but it opened. I'd cow, but it fucking happened. I ignored it and went to bed, thinking it was a dream and I was just sick dreaming. You know how those dreams can get crazy. Well, I wasn't dreaming because when I woke up, boom, it was still open. The next day, still in bed sick, I remember vividly my right hand trying to strangle me. I know that sounds crazy, but I was choking myself and I couldn't stop. I had to use my left hand to stop myself. Eventually I regained control of my right arm/hand, but I never forgot what happened. Same room, same bedroom, it was the master bedroom. Another time I remember seeing a young girl walk the halls. She was wearing a blue dress and had blonde hair. She never did anything to me, didn't scare me, she was just there. She disappeared after walking into the green room, a room with green walls. This house has like 5 living rooms. There is also a graveyard next to the property. Over time the land was sold off, so we don't actually own the graveyard. In the graveyard there are graves going back to the 1700s and there is a grave of a baby. Definitely the original owners of the house. We also got shot at by a crazy neighbor one 4th of July. His name was Willie. Why do I know this? He came to our front porch one time, shirtless, to introduce himself. He had a giant scar on his back. He asked us to make sure to put away the lawnmower because people might try to steal it. The lawnmower was on the other side of the property, hidden. The only way he could have known we had one was if he was wandering our property. Anyways, he shot at us, barely missing my brother in the head. Willie's house burned down shortly after, with him in it. We don't go back there anymore. I'll take some time to type this. It's a little long, but still scares me every time I think about it and I still can't comprehend it. When I lived in Oregon I worked IT for the community college. I wasn't getting out until 9 to 10 p.m. by myself. It was a normal day like any other. By the time I left work it was pitch black and the thick underbrush made it even harder to see. This will be important later. I drove through town and finally got to the highway that lead from Lincoln City to Corvallis, which was a long stretch of empty highway that ran 1+ hours through the forest. After about 45 minutes I got to the hill that split into 2 lanes on both sides. As I accelerated in my tiny lawnmower of a car, I noticed something moving alongside the guardrail. Okay, I thought, it's a deer, no big deal, just slow down and avoid the cute little bugger. I was extra careful because the thick underbrush meant each side of the road would be a deep well of blackness that could have any little critters hiding there, waiting to jump into your windshield. Well, before I could finish that thought I saw feet. If you're from Oregon you know the homeless situation is abysmal. It wouldn't be too strange for one of them to be hitchhiking out here, but it was definitely out of sorts this late at night. Well, I decelerated to about 65, I was going 70+, and kept an eye on those white shoes walking up the road. By the time I actually realized those were legs/shoes walking, the man darted out in front of my Nissan, in what I thought was a suicide attempt. I slammed on the brakes, trying to avoid him. I'm getting goosebumps just typing this, and ended up sliding sideways going 60 miles per hour in the opposite lane while the man ran out in front of me, relentlessly. All I could see was his red plaid shirt and his body as he hit the hood of my car. When I came to a stop, he was leaning on the hood, staring directly at me. The primal fear I felt was something I didn't even know existed. The high beams of my car didn't even pierce whatever this man was. It was the blackest shadow, /void/. Then in an instant, he vanished. Gone. I was breathless. Absolutely breathless, shaking, thought I'd killed someone. I sat in the opposite lane, sideways, breathing heavily for a minute or two. I couldn't help but scream at that point and pound on my accelerator to get out of there. I called my husband screaming and crying that I just killed a man but that he disappeared and I didn't know what was happening. I left the scene, I know. Illegal. By the time I got home, 30 minutes later I was still shaking. I got out of my car and ran to the hood, seeing no dents, no handprints, nothing. I didn't sleep that night. Here's where it got more messed up. The next day at work I researched deaths on that highway and found that a man rolled his truck with his wife and child inside. All 3 died. I highlighted his name and input it into Facebook. The first profile that came up was a memorial for that man. In his profile photo, he wore a red plaid shirt. I returned a few weeks later. In that same area where my skid marks were was the guardrail. Tied to that guardrail was, and probably still is, a moldy child's toy, a rabbit. Something is deeply, deeply haunted about that highway. I'm just glad there wasn't anyone in the oncoming lane or I too would be trapped there along with that man. Whoever he was. I was driving home after dropping off my friend. I was on a 2-lane highway in a wooded area, with at the time, no street lights. At the base of a hill I see a guy in my headlights, his back to me, walking up the hill. Black hoodie with hood up, kinda hunched forward, black pants. As I get closer he suddenly runs in front of me. Right when I hit him and he pitched forward to my windshield, he disappeared. I was terrified because I saw the hoodie head angled down. No face, it was black where his face should have been. I called my mom crying, I just hit a guy. Like you, I left because while I stopped I saw no one. Got home and not even a scratch. I still 20 years later avoid that area majority of the time. It made me avoid that road for years. My paternal grandmother was very involved in her church community and would often bring me along for get-togethers, parties, funerals and other functions that involved people we knew. I was probably 7 or 8 when we visited a nice old lady and her family to deliver gifts the church had put together for them. My grandmother being herself, she quickly caught up in conversation, which left me time to roam around a little. The house was large and featured a long, tall wooden staircase to the upstairs. I had never seen a staircase so tall and wanted nothing more than to make it to the top. But when I took the first step with my hand on one of the support columns for the banister, I saw a very tall man looking down at me from the top. He was leaning on the banister and with an incredibly deep voice, complete with the heavy southern drawl, he told me, "Boa, them stairs ain't safe, you is too little. Don't you come up them stairs or I'll give you a whippin'." Being the good kid I was, I apologized and left the room, though I'm pretty sure his eyes followed me. Fast forward about 15 years and I met one of the old lady's grandchildren at her funeral. I asked about the grandfather, who I presumed the tall man was, and I was told he died almost 30 years prior. Apparently, he had fallen down those steps and cracked his head. The grandkid thought I was pranking him, but I was in disbelief. "Tall man with a deep voice?" I asked. He looked at me with shock. "Yeah, me ma said he had one." "How do you know that?" I casually replied, "I met him once. I managed a internet cafe, comic shop that was in an 150-year-old building. On this particularly day we had a bunch of people that wanted to keep gaming after hours, so we closed quite late. After finally getting all the customers out after midnight, I was doing some paperwork in the back office. I was alone in the store for about an hour when I looked up out the two-way mirror and saw someone standing near the front of the store. Most of the lights were off, but I could clearly see a man wearing a fedora standing by a front cash register. The building we were in was quite large and the distance from the back of the store to the front was close to 100 feet. We had big bay windows backlit by street lamps and I could clearly see a person standing like they were waiting for service. I cursed myself for forgetting to lock the door, walked down the hallway and out into the main store area, and there was no one there. Double-checked the door. Locked tight. I felt like I wasn't alone, but after flicking the lights back on, it seemed I was. Lights off, back to my papers. Half an hour later I felt myself being watched. I looked up out the mirrored window again and saw the same shadow, except this time it was a few feet to the left and much closer. A man, on the short side, wearing a fedora, facing the security window. I immediately grabbed my keys and left out the back door. I have several. One time my now ex and I were laying in bed watching TV. I'm quite tall, so my feet go right to the edge of the mattress. What feels like a hand grabs and squeezes my foot. Weirded out and assuming there is a logical explanation, I ask her, "How did you just squeeze my foot with your foot?" She goes, "What are you talking about?" and wiggles her feet. They were well away from mine. We were both speechless and utterly creeped out. All I could do was pull my feet in close. When I was 26, my mother bought a house. She took me on a tour and I saw the entire house except one bedroom. She wanted me to see it, but I couldn't cross the threshold without the feeling of something attacking me. I told my mother somebody or something evil died a horrible death in that room and I would not enter it unless it was blessed by her priest. She laughed at me. 2 weeks later, the homeowner before came over to get mail. She and my mom sat down to chat and my mom mentioned my misgivings about that room. That's when the previous owner said that's where I shot and killed that evil man. My mom pressed for details and discovered that 20 years earlier the woman was home alone when she suffered a home invasion. She was violently hit and as he attempted to crawl out of the window, she shot him in the back and let him bleed to death before calling 911. He was a known predator wanted for murder in 3 states. My mom had a sage scrub and a blessing done and then I was able to enter that room. My mom and I went to the Flight 93 Memorial in Pennsylvania a few years ago on a cold, snowy winter day. I think there were only 2 other visitors there who had left by the time we walked down to the wall with the names of the victims on them, which is the field where the plane crashed. We were standing there then suddenly heard all these voices. It sounded like a big group of people talking loudly. We didn't think anything of it because we were reading the plaques, but the second we got back to the car we both mentioned hearing a bunch of people talking/yelling and realized there wasn't anyone else even close to there. Bit of background. My dad was in the military and was stationed in Germany when I was a kid. My homeschool group traveled to a ruined concentration camp as a field trip. All throughout the tour, I felt like someone was watching me and more than once I swore I heard crying. When we went through the shower, I nearly screamed because I felt something push against my back towards the wall. I told my parents I wanted to go home then and there. Unfortunately, we had to finish the tour. My mom was very sick over 2 years with stomach pain, tiredness and more symptoms. She went to many doctors, tried many meds, but nothing ever helped against anything. A friend of my grandmother is calling herself a medium. She speaks with a ghost called Patna. I never believed in stuff like this, still don't really, but this made me think twice about my suspicion. The medium offered to help to find out what was wrong with my mom, and we were like, okay, if she wants to do this, let her do this, we have nothing to lose. So the medium asked the ghost in a ceremony what was wrong with my mom. The ghost answered that she was poisoned. We didn't know what to do with that information, but my mom was so desperate to find a solution that she got a big blood count done. It said that she was actually poisoned with quecksilver. Turns out, my mom had an old amalgam filling for her teeth, and when she got a new one, with a metal of higher quality, the old one disassembled the new one. These amalgam fillings are mixed with quecksilver, so when it was disassembled, my mom got slowly poisoned with quecksilver. A few weeks after it was removed, all the symptoms stopped, so a ghost kind of helped my mom. I have no idea how my grandma's friend should get to this explanation. Maybe it was luck, maybe I'm not open-minded enough to believe in that, but it was definitely spooky. Growing up, I had just seen the movie White Noise. And I was, and still am, big into the paranormal stuff. Dreams happily of the day I met Zach Baggins. So I thought I would try to talk to the dead. At the time, I had an urn with my dad's ashes, took them out, put them on my bed and sat there with a digital recorder and started to ask questions, talk, and listen back. I heard nothing, and after about 30 minutes assumed I was just dumb, or needed better gear. But I was 15, so like, where was I getting the money? So I got up, turned around, and that's when, alone in the house at 1 a.m., there was a single knock at the front door. But not like a pounding, just like a gentle tap, like you had to knock, but you were trying not to be noticed. So I go out, sweating bullets, and I happen to be able to see the front porch outside the door from inside, so I pop on the lights. Nothing is there. The front yard, driveway, and yard are empty. So I close the blinds, go back to the door and turn the lights off. Maybe a half second later I can hear this sound, like someone was dragging their nails individually down the little cross-hatching of a screen door. A quick tick 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 tick. But no one was there, and there is just no way I missed it or they ran up that fast. So I immediately put my back against the door and just said loudly, "I'm sorry, Dad, I won't do it again." And the sound immediately stopped. And I will never, ever try that shit again. My house was built in 1962 and has only had one owner. That owner passed peacefully in her sleep in the house. Every now and again I feel her presence when I'm doing things like using the laundry line and digging in her garden. I've seen her at night in my kids' rooms, but she is a comforting grandmother feel, so I leave her. The creepiest was the man in my mirror. He was evil and has appeared to both my dad, my husband and me. He was old plantation owner and always glared at me, and I could feel him squeezing my legs. He rushed my dad when Dad saw him. One time, in the dead of night, I heard a faint whisper coming from my closet. When I investigated, there was no one there, but I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was downright chilling. When I was maybe 16 or 17, I was asleep in my room when I suddenly jolted awake and flipped the light on. I was sweating and my heart was racing, but I couldn't figure out why. I didn't have a nightmare that I could remember. After a minute of trying to calm down, I had this horrible feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes immediately looked to the closed closet doors and something said in the most casual voice ever, "Hello." I jumped up and opened the doors, but nobody was there. A series of experiences. For as long as I can remember, I've seen shadows and heard creaking, closing doors, misplaced items, and other unexplainable things throughout my childhood home. I've always watched horror movies and scared myself by reading creepypastas, which means I had several different escape routes planned out depending on where the serial killer that was obviously going to come for me tried to get in. One day when I was in high school, I was home alone after school, sitting in the living room watching TV. From the mudroom that connected the living room to the garage, I heard a loud bang like someone smashing their fist against the door connecting the garage and mudroom. Ran up to the kitchen with my phone, grabbed a knife, and peeked over the counter out the window towards the front of the house. No one is outside, no cars, and the garage door was still closed, meaning no one got into the garage. No wind slammed the door. I eventually talked myself out of the whole serial killer thing, but I haven't been able to explain it, and it hasn't happened again. A different night, my parents were gone when I went to sleep. I wake up to knocking on my bedroom door. My parents wouldn't have knocked to check in on me sleeping. Without access to a weapon, I froze, because obviously this time it's gonna be the serial killer, and just laid there for 10 minutes. Never heard any footsteps. Nothing. Got up and went to my parents' room. They were both fast asleep. So it's not even like they had just come home when I heard the knocking. A different day, I set a water bottle on the kitchen counter and continued walking towards the hallway. A couple seconds later, I hear the bottle fall. But when I get back into the kitchen, the bottle is across the room. Yet another day, I was home alone in the living room when I heard a sneeze from back towards the bedrooms. My first instinct was to say bless you. My second thought was, didn't my boyfriend leave 30 minutes ago? During college, I came home for a break. I had to sleep in a loft bed, and I brought my sister's dog up with me because she liked to cuddle. I was woken up by both the feeling and sound of someone climbing up the ladder, which I was very acquainted with at that time. I could feel my sister's dog against my leg, laying between me and the edge, when I felt something pet down the blanket like they were petting the dog. I must have moved, because the dog realized I was awake and immediately turned around to jump onto my chest with her ears down, shaking. The intensity of events has toned down quite a bit. But for a stretch of time, something wanted to make itself known. While at university, I lived directly next to a purportedly haunted cemetery in what is considered one of the most haunted cities in the country. The odd part about my living situation is that the basement apartment I stayed in was uniquely below the cemetery, so you could see tombstones at about eye level from the windows. One night during the winter, I woke up freezing cold as my sheet had fallen off of my futon, sleeping on the floor. I rolled over to grab it and realized that there was a man standing and looking out of the window not 4 feet away from me. Could see details of his face clear as day as there was a floodlight through the slats of my blinds. He had glasses and a mustache and appeared to be in his mid-40s. I'm not sure why, but this didn't freak me out, and I must have chalked it up to thinking I was dreaming because I grabbed the sheet and went back to sleep without a thought. A few hours later, I woke up again to find my sheet missing, but this time it was about 30 feet away in my kitchen, which is visible from where I sleep. The man was now standing and staring the opposite way towards the cemetery, and this time I really paid attention. I sat up and said hello to no response. After staring at him standing there for what seemed to be minutes, he moved out of sight in a very odd manner, which could only be described as sliding on ice. A half an hour of sitting and staring and saying hello to the room, I finally mustered up the courage to flip on my lights and go to the kitchen to retrieve my sheet, to confirm that yep, nobody was in the apartment with me. The entire situation was bizarrely serene, didn't feel any fear at all, just confusion. Not nearly as creepy as the other ones, but one time I was walking to my friend's house in the fog as they asked me if I wanted to hang out with them. I live in an estate, and there are 2 paths to their house, side by side. One is paved and the other one is a gravel path surrounded by trees and grass. Because it was foggy out, I took the paved path as it was more open and felt safer. I have a habit of glancing around as I walk, and when I looked in the direction of the gravel path, I saw a weird shadowy figure in the trees. It was tall, skinny, and I couldn't see its head. Was as tall as the trees, I'd say. Creeped me the hell out. It wasn't moving or anything, and honestly I think it would have been much worse if it did. Hope it's just a hallucination. As a kid in my bedroom, I always felt like I was being watched from one particular corner. It always felt darker than the rest of the room as well. Something would talk to me at night. Very up close and a whisper like in my ear. Never knew what it was, but sure as hell know that after I left that house I never heard it again. When my dad lived in my house with the fam, weird shit was constantly happening. The most egregious episodes would coincide with family drama / high emotions. This night was creepy, everyone was asleep or near to it, and it was early in the morning. I was in my room in the basement by the stairs fully awake when I heard footsteps creeping up the stairs. The stairs are old wood covered by carpet, so even when you're trying to be quiet you can hear each respective stair. There would be no reason for someone to be creeping around, so it caught my attention. There's around 12 or 13 stairs and I heard each step. The steps stopped when they reached the top stair and I didn't hear anything else for a few moments, I would have heard it if they'd went to the kitchen. Then I had a sort of vision looking down the stairs, and whoever/whatever it was ran like hell down the stairs, stomping on each step. That had me sitting bolt right in my bed, and the sound faded out after it went a couple steps down the hall. I was terrified and didn't get out of my room for the rest of the night. We didn't need to be creeping around, but no one in their right mind would be stomping around like that. The next morning, we found out that everyone except my brother had been woken up by the steps, and everyone had thought it was someone else. Another time, my now fiancée, who was a skeptic until this moment, my little sister, and I were hanging out in the kitchen. Dad was asleep, other sister was napping, brother in the basement. My mom did a round of goodbyes to everyone and left for work. We're sitting there ambiently on our phones when we hear from my sister's voice from her empty bedroom, the one hanging out with us, calling Mom. Mom. Moom. We all three look up from the screens at each other and kind of sit there for a moment before one of us is like, "Did you hear that? That sounded just like you, sister's name." We went and checked my other sister, but she was half asleep and said, "Why would I be calling for Mom? She just left for work?" My fiancé didn't want to talk about this for months, but finally admitted that started him in believing things aren't what they seem on the surface. Science just hasn't caught up yet. Nothing quite like something borrowing your sister's voice while she's right in front of you. A pretty tame encounter, but one I'll never forget. I used to spend the night at my grandparents' quite frequently. Their basement is split in two, one side with concrete flooring, a workshop and outside access, albeit behind two dead-bolted doors due to theft in years past, while the other is carpeted, furnished and used as a downstairs gaming and entertainment area. Separating these two sections is an old, hollow wooden door next to the bottom of the stairs. In the back of the carpeted side is a bedroom of sorts with a majorly comfy bed I spent most nights in. One night I was sleeping peacefully when I suddenly woke up for no tangible reason. Frustrated, I sat up and rubbed my eyes, and that's when I heard it, a deliberate and noticeable knocking sound on the door to the concrete half of the basement. The door being old and hollow, there was no mistaking where the sound came from. I didn't dare navigate through the dark and open the door. I just closed my eyes and pretended it wasn't there. About 6 or 7 knocks later, it stopped. The next morning I checked that half of the basement, and sure enough both of the exterior access doors were shut and locked tight. I asked my grandfather about it and he simply responded, "I hear it sometimes, too. Don't tell your grandmother." That was over a decade ago. I lost my grandfather just over a year ago and haven't spent the night there since. Back in the day, before my husband and I had kids, we rented a small house in the older side of town. We usually watched TV in bed together before falling asleep. One night, while watching TV, I decided I was ready for bed and rolled onto my side, away from my husband. My husband got up to use the bathroom before settling down for bed. The remote to the TV was between us and the bed. When he came back to bed, he started looking for the remote, but couldn't find it. I got up and we tore the bed apart. It was nowhere to be found, even though it was literally right there just a moment before. We gave up and went to bed. We continued to look for it over the next few weeks without any luck. Then when my husband needed to dress a little fancier for work one day, he dug out his dress shoes from the back of the closet. As he's putting on his shoes, there he finds the remote, tucked into one of them. There was no possible way the remote could have gotten into that shoe, tucked into the back of the closet the way it was. Still a mystery to this day and still gives me goosebumps when I think about it. I wish I could find the picture, but when I was young we lived in a really old house and someone took a picture of me playing on the floor. Years later I was looking through the family photos and noticed that it looked like a black shadowy dog was coming through the window. It might not be paranormal, it might just be 2000s disposable cameras being garbage, but it creeped me out. I'll try to make it short. I'm not the best at explaining things. This happened at my grandpa's house, which is a very old farmhouse in the middle of the country. I was pretty young, I can't remember exactly, but maybe around 6 to 7 years old. I have a brother and a sister and we're all around the same age. We were staying the night there, visiting for a few days. That night, my brother and sister were sleeping upstairs in the 2 spare rooms. I slept downstairs in another bedroom that was around the corner from the bottom of the steps that led upstairs. It was really late, I thought everyone was asleep, and I heard running up and down the steps clear as day. Thumping up and down them, like kids were playing. I ran to the steps because I thought my brother and sister were playing without me. When I got there, no one was there. I ran back to my bed and hid under the covers. The feeling that I had when I realized no one was there has stuck with me. Before this incident, I was never one to believe in the paranormal, but this event changed that. Me and my partner went to Edinburgh for a week's holiday and sightseeing was certainly on the cards. On the first night, my partner signed us both up for a scary walking tour that included a walk into the Edinburgh vaults. This tour had about 8 people on it. My partner loves all things spooky and scary. Me, not so much, but I went along with this as it sounded interesting. The tour guide took us around the old town telling us stories and tales from the city's history before taking us down into the vaults. It was eerily quiet and very dingy, so it was perfect for a haunted tour. We were being led around and I'll admit, it was a little spooky, but I wasn't uncomfortable. I was more intrigued than anything. Then we were led into the penultimate room and I felt it get colder. My whole body just started shaking. I welled up with emotion and started crying a bit, and I had no reason why. The tour guide told us this is where a bar/tavern used to be, and in the corner is where a ghost of a young woman has been sighted many times. This woman gave birth to a stillborn child and she haunts this room to share her grief with others who ventured here. I asked the tour guide to lead me out as I needed to leave. My partner stayed behind whilst the tour guide made sure I got back to street level safely before telling me that this happens quite often and that the ghost is quite aggressive before the guide rejoined the group downstairs. I caught my breath and dried my eyes before my partner joined me a few minutes later, apparently whilst they were left alone. She stood in the next room where another ghost is rumored to haunt, and that she stood right in him. We both were a bit shaken, but after a swift drink at a local pub, we laughed and both agreed our eyes were opened a bit more after that. When I was younger, we lived in my grandparents' old house. They built a new one and had moved. The house was always creepy. There was a long hallway with no windows from the kitchen down to the end to the pink bathroom. That was the kids' bathroom and I always hated it. I hated that hallway. Whenever we were in the living room, you would always catch someone standing at the door into the hallway out of the corner of your eye. Sometimes something would pass and block the light in the hallway. At night, we'd always hear running on the roof. Our roofs are flat and there's a stairway that leads to the roof from inside the house, back and forth like they were playing catch up there. But I think the creepiest things that would happen were, we'd always see our mother, either in the hallway walking into her room or the kitchen, or she would come to our room and say something at the door, same hallway, and then turn and walk into her room. When we would follow her into the room she went into, she wouldn't be there. She would either be in a different part of the house or not be at home entirely. I was asleep on the top bunk of our bunk bed. My 2 sisters and I slept in the same room. I remember waking up late at night to the sound of my mother calling me. The voice was echoing, so it sounded like it came from the bathroom that was between our room and my parents' room. I got up, put my feet on the ladder and was about to climb down when I looked down at the bottom bunk. It was a queen-sized bed, and found my mother asleep with my sisters. She'd usually read to us every night and probably fell asleep. While I was staring at her, I heard my mother calling me again. And I remember I froze. I just kept quiet. My mind was trying to make sense. I was only about 8 or 9 years old. The voice was getting a bit impatient or angry. I was frightened and all I could do was climb back into bed and get under the covers to wait for the voice to stop calling me. I think it called me another 2 times and stopped. I don't even remember falling asleep. That was one of the scariest memories I have from that house. I hated it. We don't believe in ghosts, we believe in jinn, which are entities that can live in older areas, abandoned places and out in the deserts. But if you build in areas which were previously desert, like in our case, you could be building in places where they inhabit. Some are good, some are not, but we've been taught not to interact with them and respect boundaries. It was just probably having sleep paralysis-induced hallucinations, but I was visiting my sister in Nancy in her home she purchased about 20 years ago. Sleeping in the bedroom they prepared in the attic, I woke up at about 2 to 3 a.m. with the sight of a child standing by my bed, white eyes and symbols carved in his face. He had his palm in my chest, feeling my heartbeat. That's it, it was sleep paralysis. I couldn't move or speak or scream. Until the dream was over. My sister later told me that she and her children have heard steps in the attic and that they found a box in the attic's storage area with toys that looked like over 50 years old. That was about 8 years ago. Definitely sleep paralysis. I was at home for Christmas break and at the super old house my 2 siblings were renting. They told me they didn't use the upstairs, so all of my things were just at the top of the stairs in boxes. I went up there and there were 2 bedrooms side by side and nothing else. I had a clear view into one room. All that was in it was a basketball that didn't belong to any of us. I was sorting and super distracted by this room. It felt off and my eyes kept going back to this basketball. It bounced a little bounce. Just once. And then it started bouncing, low, slow bounces that got higher and higher. My sister and friend yelled to ask me what I was doing bouncing a ball, but I couldn't even get a word out. It just got higher and a little more aggressive and then slammed into the wall like somebody threw it and landed on the floor where it originally was and stopped. I grew up in a small village that was bombarded by the US Navy in 1882. I have stories for days, but this one is the one that still gives me chills, and it's been 25 years. I've had bad sleep paralysis once. But one time I was awake, light on, heard giggling. Tried to sleep after reading with light on, more talking. Watched that evil shit move, my blanket felt up my leg. I hated my room. I believe I've posted some or more of these in the past on here, but I'll do it again anyway. I lived in Indianapolis at the time and I used to go to a restaurant and bar called the Gaslight Inn. As of 2023 the building is still there but the restaurant is gone. This place was pretty old and had served as a speakeasy during Prohibition and was frequented by bootleggers and gangsters who happened to be passing through. At one point a ghost adventure type show had done an investigation there. You could also schedule ghost tours. I went one night with my mom and her husband for dinner. It was a relatively slow night but the food was always banging. We were seated in the bar area and towards the back was a more open area with more tables, but it was closed with chairs on the tables. There was an older couple at a table near us and the man was a bit drunk and a little loud. I had to go take a leak, so I made my way back to the other, closed part of the place where the bathrooms were. As I get to the bathroom I hear the drunk guy get up and head towards the bathroom. I close the door, lock it and do my business. Right when I'm about to wash my hands, the door handle jiggles. I say I'm in here. A couple seconds later it jiggles again. I'm like, WTF? So, as it's still jiggling, I unlock and halfway aggressively swung the door open expecting to see the drunk dude standing there, but he's all the way across the room kinda pacing back and forth. I was a little freaked out for sure. This is when I lived in Greenfield, Indiana, probably around 2005. We had an old IGA that was in a pretty old strip mall. I was in there one night around 9 p.m. or so. Store was mostly empty. As I was coming around the corner into the bread aisle, I saw a loaf of bread move straight up from the top rack on its own and then arc over and fall onto the floor. I walked over and picked it up and put it back. I told the cashier what I saw and she seemed a little freaked out. When I was really young, I lived in a small town in Indiana called Flora. It's in Carroll County. Several members of my family lived there as well, having moved from India and all over, and had been there a few years before I was even born. My aunt and her 3 daughters and their kids, my grandmother and obviously my mom and dad. My mom met my dad there. We all lived on the same street basically as well, a big U-shaped street. I lived in the middle bottom part of the U and my aunt and grandmother lived along the left leg of the U. This was all between 1975 to 1985 since I moved to India in 1985 when I was 7. The first incident here was when my mom was making dinner one night waiting for my dad to come home from work. It was summer and the front door was open but we still had a storm door shut. She was at the sink with her back towards the living room and front door. She said she felt someone flip her ponytail and she turned expecting to see my dad but no one was there. Then our cat freaked out, hissed and took off and hid under the bed. Mom said he wouldn't come out for a long time. Then there was an incident where my aunt's daughter found her young daughter fighting over a Barbie with something she couldn't see. Kinda doing the tug-o-war with it, and when her mom came around the corner, whatever it was let go and the little girl fell backwards. In that same house, in the basement, there was a wooden board propped up and held by cinder blocks. They moved the blocks and the wood and found a cobblestone tunnel about 4.5 feet high, solid with spider webs. My mom and a friend of hers decided to go explore it, so they wore long sleeves and pants and gloves taped to their clothes. They took a broom and a flashlight and went in. She said they walked a solid 2 hours in the tunnel. The tunnel would branch off pretty often and they kept to the left and they never found the end of it. But they said that occasionally there would be a spot where you could see the local businesses from below. The tunnels went all over town. My mom said when they came back, they put the board back up and a couple blocks to keep it shut. But every time they went down there, the blocks were moved and the wood was off to the side with the tunnel wide open. I found out later that the town was built on an old Indian settlement. My old house and the houses on the bottom part of the U was on the top of a big hill, and the bottom of the hill was a creek. My aunt's house along with countless others were said to be part of the Underground Railroad, and that's what the tunnels were. There were lots of little anecdotes about creepy stuff happening in that town. A sigh loud enough to wake up my mom that sounded like it came from the whole house, and then seeing an elderly couple walking down our street in old-timey clothes at 3 a.m. right after is another example. When I was 4 and left alone, I was sitting in my living room playing with Legos. When I randomly decided to look up, I saw some black figure walking from my kitchen to my living room. It then disappeared. Also, when I was 4, I had the imaginary friends phase. I treated all my friends like they were imaginary because I was more conscious of that. However, one guy's name was Invisible Todd. I'd never met a person named Todd. I treated him like a real human being, and when my mom asked how old he was, I said 57. Exactly 57. I had a drunk ghost visit me one night, basically, lol. I had flown to another city for a work project. I checked into my hotel earlier that day, left my suitcase there, and went to the office until I finished my work at like 1 a.m. I came back to the hotel, got out of my work clothes, went to sleep. When I woke up in the morning, I went to put my shoes back on and found a beer bottle cap in one of them. I don't drink that particular beer, definitely didn't during that trip, and the only time those shoes were off my feet were when I was in that room asleep. I put the door lock latch across at night, so I'm fairly confident I didn't have a nighttime visitor. Everything else was where I left it, including my wallet, phone, hire car keys, anything else someone could have taken had they come in. But all that changed was this bottle cap in my shoe. This always feels ridiculous to write or say. My dog had a heart issue, and in his middle age it got the better of him. One night he collapsed, so we took him to the emergency vet. We didn't live in the sticks or anything, but between our suburb and the next suburb over, there's a road that goes through so old farmland from decades ago that still hasn't been developed on. Anyway, the significance of that is that A, this road is poorly lit, and B, this road has no sidewalk. As we're driving up this road, Mum and Dad in the front and me in the back, with Vinny on Mum's lap, we see in the car lights what looks like an old lady walking on the side of the road, dressed in a very cartoonish old lady outfit, shawl, headscarf, pushing those trolleys old ladies have. And by the way, it was pissing down with rain. This isn't the kind of road where you'd usually see people walking, let alone at night and in the rain. It doesn't lead to anywhere except parkland, at least in the immediate sense. Eventually you'll reach suburbia, and there are no bus routes that use this road either. It's an arterial road, but effectively looks like a country road. While we didn't have to swerve to avoid her, we certainly didn't see her until she was quite close. Anyway, we didn't stop. Maybe that wasn't very charitable, but we were caught by surprise and on our way somewhere important with a sick dog. But after we drove past her, at like 80 kilometers per hour, the speed limit of this road, Vinny looked at Mum, then Dad, then me, and he just seemed at peace. It was odd, because usually he was the kind of Jack Russell that couldn't sit still, which is what killed him, ultimately. And because she gave us such a shock by just being where she was at that time of night, I did look out the back window to see if she was there, but I couldn't see her. However, that could have just as easily been because it was nighttime, the road is poorly lit, and we were driving away from her at 80 kilometers per hour. Fast forward and we get to the emergency vet, still a 15-minute drive from where we passed the old lady on the road. Vinny is taken in to stay overnight to be monitored, and we decide to go home after having been at the vet for maybe an hour or 90 minutes. 5 minutes after we arrive home, we get a phone call telling us Vinny saw a cat, got excited and had a heart attack. My beautiful dog had passed away. Anyway, the odd thing that struck me was that the random old lady probably could have walked from where she was to the vet between the time we saw her and the time we got the call that Vinny had died. So in my head, I've always wondered if she was some sort of psychopomp who was walking to meet Vinny and take him to wherever dead dogs might go. I don't buy into this sort of stuff, and aren't religious either. The truth is, she was probably just an old lady who was walking on the road late at night and in the rain, for God knows what reason, but nonetheless that's the facts of it. But the acceptance of the situation that Vinny seemed to exhibit right after we passed her weirded me out a bit. I'm sure it's just me trying to make nice stories to lessen the blow of the loss, as so many do with afterlife concepts. But even so, I'll never truly know until it's my own turn to die. Let's put it this way though, When my following dog Spot passed away, on the way to the vet I was on the lookout for ferrymen disguised as old ladies, come to take my treasured dog away from me and break my heart all over again. No matter how much you tell yourself that the supernatural isn't real, you just can't shake your own lived experiences of it, even if they are, probably, just figments. I've posted this elsewhere before. Almost 10 years ago I went in for surgery at a smallish, older hospital. I was there for 3 days total, including the day of surgery. It was a private room, set up with a half wall inside the door that blocked the view of the room/patient bed from the hall. There was a sink on the door side of that wall and a room with a toilet and shower to the side. Every person who came in the room would stop at the sink to wash their hands. The door closed automatically but the sink was operated manually. The morning of the day I was to be discharged, I was waiting for the nurse. I heard the door open, the sink turn on, the door shut, and then the sink turn off. I kept watching the wall, waiting for the person to come around and talk to me, but nobody ever came. The door didn't open again until someone else came in a while later. I was fully lucid and on minimal pain meds so I wasn't hallucinating. I was discharged and a nurse pushed me in a wheelchair to the hospital entrance. My ride wasn't up to the door yet so we chatted some. I asked her if anyone ever mentioned the hospital being haunted. She looked at me for a moment and then asked if I was on the 3rd floor at all. I told her I was on the 2nd the entire time. She said there were a lot of stories about the 3rd floor but not many about the 2nd. The car pulled up so I didn't get to ask her for stories. Thankfully I haven't had to go back since. My dad was president of the local historical society, and they have a completely furnished old house as part of their museum. He texted me one night to knock it off. I live in town and had keys to open the museum. Knock what off? So he then calls. The security cameras have the sound of the piano playing and he thought it was me pranking him. Dad, I am in my living room watching TV. Went down to check, nothing. Still weirded out by the whole thing. I've stayed in several haunted houses. My grandmother's house definitely has the spirit of the old donor hanging around. She knew the guy when he was alive, and when things got too weird she would tell Bob to simmer down. My most personal experience came in a home I rented. There were the usual things, noises upstairs when all the cats and I were downstairs, things going missing to show up later in plain sight, cold breezes. But things got weird when he started opening the bathroom door. This was an older house, and when doors were shut, they were shut. There was no ajar, there was no kind of shut. There was open, or tightly shut. For over a week, the bathroom door would open when I was in there, at the other end of the room. At first it scared me a lot. After a while, it got annoying. Sitting there, doing my business, and the door swings open. Come on, man. My grandmother encouraged me to just speak up. So one day, when I was in the shower, the door opened again. I asked the spirit politely to stop doing that. We both know you don't need to open the door to get around. Can you please give me the illusion of privacy here? It worked. That was the last time any doors opened on their own. The spirit ended up being kind of sweet. My fiancée broke up with me and moved out, and I was devastated. On particularly rough days, I would get ready for bed to find my bedroom lamp turned on for me. A small gesture, but appreciated at the time. I think it was some sort of natural phenomenon messing with our senses, but I once worked in a building where literally all of the staff heard impossible voices/saw inhuman figures. The weird part is we sometimes saw/heard the same thing at the same time, but I'm sure there's a natural explanation. I think the one that skeeved me out was seeing a figure on all fours on the roof speak to me and try to call me over. When I was younger and still lived in my old house, I shared a bedroom with my sister. We both had twin beds on opposite sides of the room, and mine was next to a window. It wasn't large by any means, but I could see the house to the left. Mind you, this house looked terrible. Had a for lease sign and everything out in the front. Now, I was an insomniac then and still am, so I was up late one night on my phone and occasionally checking outside my window. I switched my gaze back and forth until I saw the door of the house open. Initially, I got a bad feeling and just brushed it off as my eyes messing with me. I had believed that until I saw a woman taking out the trash. It's midnight. Later than that probably. I keep staring at her like she'll go away or I'm being crazy and I'm not seeing this. Until she looks dead at me. I don't know what kicked in me not to look away and duck under the covers then. She stares at me until she gets this big, Cheshire grin on her face like she caught me or something. To this day, I have no idea how she saw me because the lights from both the street light across the house and my phone aren't that bright. Thinking about her face turns my stomach into knots. Finally, my mind and my common sense caught up to me and I laid my ass down and didn't get out of bed until morning. I remember not fully comprehending that happened, outside of the initial dread and terror. Like, I'm a horror fanatic and it felt like something I'd hear on YouTube in those hour-long story compilations. We moved out of that house a few years ago and in the rare moments I go back, I still see that for lease sign outside. Years ago, after I had inherited some war trophies that my great-uncle brought back from the Pacific Theater, I caught a glimpse of what I could only describe as a reflection of a Japanese soldier in a mirror. Would also hear heavy footsteps and a friend said she got shoved. Two of the items were a small Japanese flag and a sword that was dated to the late 18th century. I had both displayed on my mantle. After a couple months I took them down and packed them away. The weirdness stopped for the most part. Last night. Woke up to howling. It's literally howling, but not a high-pitched howling you'd expect from a dog. This was demonic. I thought it was a dream, but I realized I was awake, and so was my husband. It was what you'd expect to hear from a werewolf. Our dogs didn't react to the noise, so it tells me it wasn't coming from one of them, and the noise wasn't coming from the living room where our dogs were. It sounded like it was right outside our door. It was a seriously what was that moment. I didn't want to move. I had never felt more terrified in my life than last night. Even my husband was hesitant to get up and see what the noise was. I've had several encounters before, but only one really has freaked me out. For context, my encounters have been both in extremely vivid dreams and when I've been awake. The awake ones probably startle me more, but they're few and far between and have been harmless. I don't often have the vivid dreams, but when I do, I wake up with messages. One night, I dreamt my best friend's mom came to visit me and asked me to take care of her daughter. My best friend made me promise. When I woke up that morning, I learned that she died from cancer. The encounter that scared me was when I was staying over at my husband's house for the first time. I had a very vivid dream about a woman in posh Victorian clothes who rode a stagecoach. I had a number of children around me that I didn't recognize, but I somehow instinctively knew she was there to do them harm, so I hid them in a special spot in a tunnel. No idea which one or where we were. She rode up to me, got out of the carriage, and demanded I give her the children or else she'd come after me. I told her that I'd stand in her way forever and that she could never have the children or hurt anyone else. She pulled a gun and went to shoot me, but my husband woke me up before she struck me. Her words to me as I was waking up were, "I'll get those kids. You won't stop me forever." I didn't want my husband to think I was some weirdo. It was the beginning of our relationship, so I didn't say anything about it. But I started connecting some dots. His roommate, his BFF, was a single mom with multiple kids, and it turned out to be the same number of kids I was protecting. And while watching Ghost Adventures, my husband told me that there's a lady in white who wears a fancy dress who he's seen in the hallway late at night. His BFF has seen her too. Needless to say, I was very upset with that dream, and subsequently was very happy that everyone moved away from that house. I was driving home from work. I usually took the country roads to avoid traffic. As I was going down my usual route, I saw someone's taillights flashing a ways down the road, maybe a mile or so. I found it odd and hoped it wasn't any serious trouble. A minute goes by as I approach and the lights are still flashing, not moving from what I can tell. As I came closer, maybe a few hundred yards, the lights started to fade until there was nothing. At that point, I had slowed down in case it was someone who broke down. I was maybe going 30 as I came closer, but there was nothing. No car on the side of the road, and no roads going anywhere off the sides. It was a straight shot, no obvious tracks to indicate someone going off the road, cornfields on both sides so no way they drove through the field, and the road ahead was clear, no humps or dips where they could have disappeared from sight. There weren't any of those reflectors either. I'm obviously not stopping to investigate, especially since there wasn't any way of pinpointing exactly where the lights were. I continue on my way, back up to speed after a while, and see no evidence of any other vehicle both ahead and behind me. There was just a random occurrence of two flashing red lights in the middle of the night out on a country road. My theory outside of paranormal activity is it was maybe two bikers with those lights on the back, Even though it doesn't make sense why they would just disappear like that unless they were doing something shady and avoiding being seen, which doesn't make sense since they had those lights to begin with and that's the whole point of them, is to be seen. Other than that, what else could those lights have been? When I was little, I would spend hours in my bedroom alone playing with my Barbies. On one occasion, I was in my room playing while my mom and brother were in another room playing games on our computer. Every now and then I could hear them laughing and talking, but it wasn't loud enough for me to take serious notice of. In the middle of playing I heard a loud laugh coming from my closet. I was facing the direction of my closet and bedroom door, which were right next to each other, so I knew there wasn't any way of my brother sneaking in on me. It wasn't a quiet laugh either. I've always described it as sort of a witch's cackling. I remember when I finally got the courage to stand up that I booked it out of my room, went to my brother's room, and being so confused why I heard someone laughing in my closet when there were only 3 of us home. After that, I could never sleep in my room by myself or go in there without a light on. Fast forward a couple years and my family has moved to a different house. I would still get a weird vibe every now and then, but nothing that would totally freak me out. I was still scared of sleeping alone, so some nights my brother and I would sleep in my room together, or we would sleep in his where he had a bunk bed. On one of the days where we slept in his room, he slept in the bottom bunk while I was on top. I've always had problems with not being able to sleep through the night and waking up randomly early in the morning, so on this day it happened, but I thought nothing of it. While I was trying to fall back asleep, I vividly remember facing my brother's closet and barely shutting my eyes when I heard the same exact laugh I heard a few years before, except this time right behind me. There wasn't any space behind me except for my stuffed animal that was separating me from the wall, so you could imagine how absolutely terrified I was. I couldn't move for what felt like forever, and when I peeked over the edge to see if my brother was messing with me, he was knocked out snoring. It hasn't happened again since then, but I still think about it when I'm home alone or waking up in the middle of the night. I sleep alone. My bedroom faces a small canal known for suicides and people dumping ashes. There are nights where I've been woken up to crowd noises, people talking, discussing loudly. You know how it sounds, there are people talking but it all sounds gibberish, can never make out anything, only to stop and turn to pin drop silence when I am fully awake in the middle of the night. Due to it, it's always between 2:30 to 3 a.m. The crowd just sounds so lively, as if there are 200 to 300 people standing just beneath my bedroom window. I've tried checking out sometimes by peeking to find no living soul around. Might be hallucinations, might be paranormal. Another instances where I've heard my granny and aunt, sometimes other members, joint family, discussing in the living room. Again, voices with normal volume but gibberish. When I go see in the living, it's empty, they are asleep in their bedrooms. Too much movement for an old lady and a woman with severe arteritis. If it was a prank. I heard someone whisper my name while I was in an empty hospital after hours at a bank of elevators. My ex is nah, and he once told me if I hear my name and don't recognize the voice, don't react and make it repeat itself in hopes there's an actual person calling you, and not a witch. I remembered what he said, and it didn't repeat itself. Scared the shit out of me. We had already had multiple instances of haunting in the apartment. The bathroom was the center of it. You could pull the shower curtain shut, leave the room for a couple of seconds, and the curtain would be open a few inches. Didn't matter how long you left. 10 minutes, an entire day, 3 seconds. That curtain wouldn't stay closed. I have 2 friends that are lightning rods for weird shit. They both saw the same thing. A teen girl, pale except for her hair, sitting and clutching her legs, rocking back and forth in the tub. The apartment was situated at the bottom of a hill, so the backside of it was underground. There was a door in the breezeway that led to what we Alabamians call a crawl space, even if it's large enough to stand in. In the crawl space, you could see the back walls of my apartment, as well as the apartment across the hall, both of them just smooth drywall, until you got to where that bathroom would be. There, the drywall was ripped and torn. The only other important thing about the crawl space is that it was ventilated by a gap on a far wall, covered with a standard slotted vent cover. It was maybe 7 feet up the wall, from the inside. From the outside, the vent was a few inches above the ground. When we decided to move, the new place offered a free month. You could take it up front or spread it out over the lease. We took it up front, overlapping it with the end of our lease at the old place. This gave us a nice easy month to leisurely move. I promise I'm getting to the creepy shit, so we take our time, and toward the end of the month I was packing up our closet, which shared a wall with the haunted bathroom. My fiancée was packing up the master bathroom closet, which shared the perpendicular wall with the haunted bathroom. It's dark and oppressive in the apartment. This is nothing new, situated semi-subterranean. One doesn't expect a lot of light, but it's not just dark, it's pushing down on our shoulders, drawing our eyes to the floor. A crunch, then, as something stabs into the corner of the walls, from the side of the bathroom. It drags down, sounding like nothing so much as claws rending through plaster, scratching deeply as if trying to get to us both. I froze. So did she, babe? She asked, meaning was that me? Did I fall or scrape something? No, and we fled, as the sound of a kettle whistle came from nowhere, the pitch growing higher and higher. I heard an angry shriek that wasn't Laura. It was a week before I went back, with one of my lightning rod friends. We took the long way around, choosing to walk around the side of the building and down the hill instead of taking the stairs. There, on the grass, lay the vent cover, easily 8 feet away from the gap in the mortar, as if it had been blown out with great force. We walked into the apartment, and I swear there's more light in there than there's ever been. My shoulders were light. My friend looked at me, and nods. There's nothing here, I say. She's gone. That's when I realized that she knew we were leaving, and she was pissed that she couldn't torment us anymore, and she left, blowing out the grate on the vent as she did so. There's a part of me that wants to know if she's just a manifestation of the thing I saw when I was 5. It felt the same, in my gut, and that chills me, because it means this thing is following me, and I really don't want to see her again. Alright. Time to tell my favorite story. So when I was 17, I was visiting this tourist attraction which happens to be Ireland's most haunted house. They're turning it into a hotel. This should be fun, and at the time I had ass-length hair. We were doing the tour and the guide was talking about how the girl who was locked in the room we were in after going crazy had this massive love for her hair and nails and often liked to touch hands with painted nails or play with long hair. I was a few feet away from my family and they couldn't properly reach me, so when I felt my ponytail get lifted and a cold hand on my neck, my stomach near shot out onto the floor. The tour guide was excited when I told her after though. She'd never had anyone on one of her tours actually have that happen and got a photo with me to commemorate it. Either way, I got a chop at the end of the summer lmao. I don't know if it was paranormal or just instinct, but one night me and some family members were swimming at the beach at night. I was leaving early going back to my campsite, when I just kind of froze. I tried to move but I couldn't make my legs go forward. I wasn't scared and didn't feel any kind of presence. My body just physically wouldn't let me move forward. I was just kind of confused as to why my body was so freaked out, which in turn freaked me out. I looked at my surroundings and my feet, it was all completely normal. I've never experienced this again or found out what triggered it. I went back to that same location, at the same time, and copied exactly what I did that night. I walked completely fine. Thinking about it freaks me out a little. What caused that reaction? How did I pick up on it without being aware of it? When I was younger, about 4 to 5, I lived in a house inhabited by something other than humans. I'm not going to say a haunted house because I wouldn't really consider it that. Most nights my 5-year-old self would get dragged off my bed and onto the floor. This got so bad to the point where I was going upstairs to sleep with my mother every night. There was even a time where my mom and sister heard me scream and came rushing into my room to find my half out of my bed with the freshly tucked in sheets pulled out. They tucked me back in and reassured me everything was okay, and as soon as they closed the door, I was back out of bed with the sheets pulled out again. Another time my mom and sister were in the kitchen, making my mom a coffee, and they had left my mom's car keys on the bench behind them. I wasn't at home at the time because I was off at a play date. They finished making the coffee and looked behind them, only to find the keys to not be there. They searched the whole house only to then find the keys on the middle of my mom's bed. Also, my mom would constantly hear knocking coming from the inside of her walk-in wardrobe and the pantry. She would also hear what could only be described as ice cream truck music. Turns out, the house was built on a burial ground, so I grew up in a haunted house which was over 350 years. Lots of stuff happened but I saw nothing. I heard lots and experienced a lot over the years. I was terrified. When I was a teenager, I thought that if I survived this long, they must not be evil or out to get me. The day after my father died, my sister and mother went to get formalities done to issue a death certificate. I was alone at home. No windows or doors open, no way of wind blowing through. In Hinduism, We have a ritual where you keep a oil dia, earthen bowl where we put oil and wick and light it, and an iron tongs in the room where the person died, to prevent bad spirits from entering the house. Well, the room was kept open. Out of nowhere, the door slams shut violently. When I say violently, I mean violently. It closed the same way as a person slamming the door. It wasn't a self-closing door, and it had a magnetic stopper at the back, so it takes some force to close it. 14 Naomi was shit scared and called my mother from the landline. 2008, no cell phone until you 18. My mother, sister, uncle, and aunt came home while I was hiding in my sister's room. The dia was not lit and they confirmed all windows and doors were closed. Thankfully, nothing else. But that door slamming sound is still imprinted on my mind. New Orleans French Quarter, old building converted to a hotel. I woke up in the middle of the night to the smell of burning hair. Laid there think WTH for a few seconds. Rolled over to look at the clock and there was a floating green woman's head with her hair on fire. The head turned and looked at me and then disappeared. The room smelled like burning hair for about 5 minutes. The hallway smelled fine. Freaked me out. So, this one happened to me quite recently, about a week ago, and looking back, it could have been an animal, but here goes. I don't like being outside at night, it freaks me out. And living in a rural area, I've read too many skinwalker/Wendigo/Rake stories to hang out in a field at midnight, but I left my cat outside, and being that coyotes roam my property, I always bring him in to be safe. I went out with my phone's flashlight, and started calling quietly for him, not wanting to wake my household up. I went toward my fence and aimed my light at the tall grass on the other side. There, I saw a pair of eyes. I know what you might be thinking, it's my cat, right? Nope. Cat's eyes glow green/greenish yellow under light. This eyeshine were white, almost tinted with blue. And it wasn't a deer, it was very low to the ground. Maybe 3 to 4 feet. And as I was staring at them, practically frozen, they disappeared. No rustle to indicate that whatever was standing there ran away, just a silent blink out. My heart was pounding, and I turned around and saw my cat near a shed close to my house, looking spooked and staring at the same spot the eyes had been a moment ago. I scooped him up and ran inside, terrified. The next day I went out with my dog, and took her to sniff the spot that I had seen the eyes. She kept circling, and whining, and the fur on the back of her neck was standing up. It's safe to say that I'm not going back outside at night again for a long time. One time when I was younger, I was at my grandparents' house, and they collect rather unsettling dolls in a room, and they're in a display case. I was upstairs in a bedroom that was a very short walk away from the doll room, and I hear this slow creaking noise. I was the only one on the floor, so it seemed. I got off the bed and went to check on the creaking noise. The display case had opened itself, and it was locked. Well, it was supposed to be. I didn't even check to see if it was locked. I just bolted down the stairs and ran to the basement where my family was. I was up really late one night. I can't recall exactly what I was doing. To be honest, I was probably scrolling on my phone. At this time, I had a loft bed, which had LED Christmas lights decorated around it. I usually had to turn the brightness down because it was too bright. As I was on my phone, I heard a voice. It sounded like a radio when it isn't exactly on the channel. Static. Male. It said something along the lines of Montree. Then a black head popped up above the ledge of my bed, where my feet were, for about 8 seconds. Then there was scratching on my door, and that was the end of it. Throughout this entire experience, what I remember the most was this sick feeling of dread and abandonment while it was all happening. This was also my first experience, so that probably influenced the fact that it is the scariest. Since then, there have been cases where I would hear knockings, unexplained whispers, and footsteps. I still don't know how to tell this to people without them accusing me of making it all up. Afterward, I did some Googling, but I still can't find out what Montree means. I also moved away from this home. I know there is an explanation for it, but I am unfamiliar with which religion would do this, so my family and a few others used to rent a beach house in Garden City, South Carolina. One time the house we rented was across from a religious compound of some sort for teenagers. They had their own volleyball court and basketball court and generally kept to themselves. Well, one night when I was very young I saw them all walk out onto the court wearing robes and standing in a circle. I must have been around 6 or 7, Because I couldn't really grasp what I was looking at. I was raised Catholic, but it looked like no practice I had ever seen, and it was at night, which was strange to me. We would stay at that house for a few following years, but I had never seen it again. I've been having paranormal encounters for over 40 years and none of them have been creepy. Some have been quite amazing. But the most meaningful activities/encounters involved my son. I have the image of my son's face and a photograph of his sister and her boyfriend 2 months after he died. One day my husband was working on his car when my brother drove by on his way to see our mom. He called my husband sounding a bit freaked out and asked who was standing there talking to him. My husband asked what he was talking about because he was alone, and my brother said a kid who looks just like Matt was standing there watching you work on the car. There was no one with my husband. My little grandson has been heard taking to someone, and when asked who he is talking to he says Uncle Matt. He was born years after my son passed away. When I was about 12 years old I woke up at 3 a.m. and saw an apparition standing next to my bed. It was translucent, softly glowing white and wearing a long robe that hid the face and any features. I was terrified and jumped out of bed and went to sleep with my parents. It took me about an hour to fall asleep, but I told myself it was just a bad dream. The next day we had dinner at my uncle's house and we were all sitting around the table. I was yawning and having trouble staying awake. My parents told my uncle that we didn't sleep well that previous morning because I thought I saw something next to the foot of my bed. My uncle's face suddenly took on a very serious expression and he asked what time it occurred. They said it was 3 a.m. My uncle then reminded us that was the exact time their mother, my grandmother, had died exactly 1 year ago. We were shocked and I still don't really know what to make of it even today. It's never happened again and I'm now 50. In 2003 to 2004, I was living in Rochester, New York for work. I was fresh out of college and my buddy and I accepted a job living right in the downtown area. After staying in an extended stay for about a month, we found a cool apartment right above a bar about a block from work. Seemed perfect. So we quickly became friends with the staff at the bar and would hang out after closing. So it would be like 3 a.m. and we would just be sitting around the bar and we would hear people walking around in our apartment. The first few times we ran up thinking we were being robbed. But no one was there. Bar staff told us the place was like 200 years old and was haunted. No one seemed to know the history of the building though, so I went to the town's library and found they had a records department. Turns out the building was used as storage for dead bodies in the basement back in the days when they were unable to bury people in the winter. It gets super cold up there and the ground is like concrete, so bodies had to be stored until the ground thawed out in the spring. Nothing crazy ever happened except hearing footsteps and an occasional whisper. I only lived there for about 8 months, but I went from being a skeptic to a believer in that time. When I was young I had a recurring experience where I would be woken up during the night and I would be unable to feel anything around me with any of my senses. Not my bed, or sheets, not hear my brother breathing beside me, no touch, nothing other than a group of paranormal beings. Now it's strange to describe because somehow I could see them despite nothing being able to really see in this state. As though my perception of them was being input into my mind instead of my mind forming a perception of them. The odd part about it was I could feel two things from them: that they had no desire to harm me, that they were taking extreme caution to not harm me. As though this slight interaction with them was risky and could result in unspeakable things happening to me. Which terrified me. But I didn't have the notion of these unspeakable things being bad. More that I couldn't comprehend it. As though a wrong move could make me simply cease to exist. It finally stopped when my mom had someone who was a Native American shaman, sorry if I have the term wrong, I don't know what she called herself, do a ritual in the room. Could have been a form of sleep paralysis. We were talking about my father's funeral one day. My daughter was about 4 at the time of the funeral and 14 when we were talking about it. She gasped and said, "That was his funeral? Can't be." I remember him sitting next to Grandma. He was chashing me when we were walking through the cemetery. I looked at a picture of my oldest brother from that time period and he didn't have gray hair. My brother was sitting next to my mother. My dad was 85 when he died and couldn't run around. I seem to remember my daughter running around by herself. When I was about 7, I visited my aunt's house during the summer in Columbus, Ohio. It's been passed down through family since it's been built. It has this old barn across the pond that's been leaning since 1930. Before the barn was being used for old boats and base food, it was a blacksmith workshop built sometime around 1870-80. I was with my sister, who is just a bit older, and we ran around the lake to the old barn just ahead of my father and aunt. As I round the trees to the barn, my aunt hollers, "Don't play in the barn. There's copperheads and spiders." I look up to the transom window. I see a man. Looked about 30. He almost looks like he's peering out with a big smile. Without really thinking, I yelled, "Hey, what are you doing in there? You're gonna get bit." I look back to tell my aunt and dad but can just barely see them rounding the corner. I looked to my sister, and we both looked back to the barn, and the man was gone. The ladder and walkway were firewood years ago anyway from what I heard, so there's no way someone could be up there. I ran to the barn just like I was told not to and ran right just up to the door and looked in, but it was silent. Not a breeze. Every single hair stood up on my arms, neck, and back. It had to have been around 90 degrees and like walking through a wet blanket out there, but when I stepped one foot in that barn and I was frozen. I wasn't scared, as I didn't even know what just happened, but I was confused as was my sister. We turned back and asked my aunt, who the man in the was, and she gave my dad a concerned look. That's what scared me. We walked around and didn't see anyone, so we headed back to the house, just until a couple of years ago. I was doing some research on my family history, and my uncle was brought an old safe that was held by a family friend. No one in the family knew it existed. Not even the family that held it in their basement for who knows how long. They had gotten it open, and there were birth and death certificates along with photos and drawings. A blue handkerchief is what stood out to me, though, as if it was the same withered one I saw tied around the neck of that man I saw in the barn. Even the smell of opening that safe reminded me of that day. I looked through the small stack of old black and white Kodak photos, one of them from May 1910 with the name Emmett on the back, and has the same exact man, standing at the barn doors with an Appaloosa and Thoroughbred, wearing a light long sleeve, with a dark handkerchief around his neck. After I told my cousin about the whole thing, I go to message my sister the picture of Emmett. She called back freaking out, saying she had forgotten all about that and always thought it was our imagination or lack of sleep, lol. The next day, I called my father, and we talked about the first trip we took out there as a family and everything he remembered, if he remembered my sister and I yelling at someone in the barn. If anyone was in our family named Emmett. He remembered every bit of it. He didn't tell us for obvious reasons, but Emmett was my great-grandfather. He lived on that land with his parents till he died in that barn. I looked through the death certificates, and there were Emmett's, says nothing but May 1910 blacksmith shop. I tried not to ask my aunt much, but as much as she heard, there was an ox yoke or something that was being lifted to store in the rafters and came back down and hit him right in the head. 34 years old. Shame. Now and then, I'll go back there. I make sure I go and just give some warm energy by the old barn, sing some old songs. It's always felt more welcoming. Feels like I have a connection to him even when my elders don't. I haven't seen him since I was a child, but I feel stillness whenever I visit. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and we will see you in the next video.